In this environmental and resource economics video, I'd like to talk about consumer demand and where it originates from, and that's utility. So let's get right into it. Okay, let's talk about consumer utility. And I'm going to tell a story here about a ship. It's the SV Concordia. Back in 2010, there was a bunch of students on the ship and on a floating classroom traveling around the seas and learning. And unfortunately, when it was off the coast of Brazil, it encountered a storm and the boat flipped over and everybody had to get out into life rafts, and thankfully they were all fine. But they spent 2 days at sea, and I think you can probably imagine what that must have been like, being 2 days at sea about 100 kilometers off the coast of Brazil. So picture, if you will, of course, the joy and excitement when they got back to shore, but especially you can imagine how hungry they would have been. So let's use that example then to talk about consumer utility. And I'm going to assume that they ended up in a pizza restaurant, even though I know it's Brazil and that's probably quite unlikely. So let me talk about the relationship then between somebody who's really hungry and doesn't have any food, is quite starving, and has a piece of pizza, and how much enjoyment and satisfaction they would get from that. So in economics, we call that utility. So think about the first slice of pizza that student had. It would be incredible, right? After not eating for 2 days, they would have had this just enormous amount of satisfaction from that first piece. The second piece would have been very excellent too, but not quite as good as the first one. And the third one would have been also excellent, but even a little bit less than the previous one, and so on. So if I were to graph that, you can imagine sort of a amount of food or pizza by the slice on the bottom horizontal axis, and the amount of enjoyment or utility on the vertical axis. So you can see here that the amount of enjoyment, this is total utility, would probably start out to go up like this. Each piece would add, the person would be more and more full, but then probably at some point they would become overfull, if you will, and start to not feel quite as good. So let me break that down a little bit more by looking specifically piece by piece how economists would describe that. So in this graph here, I have the amount of utility, and we can think of that as satisfaction, comfort, something like that, on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, I have the number of pieces of pizza that have been consumed. So let's look at that very first piece, and you'll notice that there's two graphs here. There's this marginal graph and then a total graph. So perhaps I'll just describe that. So marginal is the piece by piece analysis. So each individual piece would have a certain amount of utility associated with it, and that is what this marginal one graphs out. The total is the cumulative addition of all of those over a period of time. So let's start with this first piece. So over here we can see this person's really, really hungry. They have that first piece of pizza. Maybe it's the first thing they've eaten in 2 days. An incredible amount of satisfaction and joy. Here, the utility of that first piece is fairly high. Indeed, you can see that every piece after that declines. So the second piece they get, some satisfaction from, not as much as the first, and third and so on, all the way down here like this. So in terms of the total amount of utility, and you might think of that as how satiated or full the person is, that's going up and up and up and up and up, but it crests out here at this point. And in fact, you'll notice that here, the fifth piece of pizza is pretty much one that doesn't make them feel better or worse, and that is the maximum total amount of utility that they're going to get. After that, the sixth piece of pizza is actually something that's, well, I wish they hadn't had, and indeed that seventh one even more so. So their overall feeling of well-being then goes down this way. Now the basic concept behind this is what economists would describe as the law of diminishing marginal utility. And what that really means is when you don't have very much of something that you want, the very first units you consume of that are really enjoyable and give you the most utility, and then over as you continue to consume them, each additional unit, and that is the marginal definition, each additional unit gives you less and less satisfaction. So what can we do with that? Where are we going to go from there? Imagine if, instead of just speaking about how much enjoyment it gave you, instead you translated that into how much would you be willing to pay, or how much would these students be willing to pay for each individual piece of pizza, imagine that they had to consider like an auction. They had to offer the maximum amount that they would be willing to pay for that piece of pizza. So you can see the first one here, I've got it graphed out. The first one that they would pay $38 to consume that very first piece of pizza. Pretty extraordinary, I'm sure you would agree. The second piece, much, much lower. They're down to about $26. The third piece, perhaps around $15, $17, and going down from there, $12 and $7 and so on, down in this direction. So you can see the general idea here is that the person's utility that they get from something diminishes, and therefore their willingness to pay diminishes. Now, I just in fact have noticed that I have a positive number here for 6, and probably if it was not making them feel very well, they wouldn't pay for that. That's just a bit of an error on my part on this graph. So the overall idea then, diminishing marginal utility from consumption leads to a diminishing willingness to pay on a piece-by-piece basis. So if I were to say, what is the total willingness to pay for 3 units, we can add up, the willingness to pay for the first one, which is 38. Remember, I have the quantity across the bottom here and the price up the vertical axis. So 38 plus the second piece at 26 plus the third piece at 17 equals $81. By contrast, if I said, well, what is the marginal willingness to pay for the third piece, I would just strictly look at this one, follow it over here to the price axis, and that would be $17. So that gives you some indication about the difference between marginal and total, and they're really key concepts that end up in economics all over the place. Marginal productivity, marginal profit, total profit, marginal cost, total cost, on and on. So it's really something that you should get familiar with early on. So in the previous example, I had this sort of stepwise progression coming down here. You can imagine that many different goods or things that people would consume would have more kind of smaller increments of consumption. We might then be able to smooth this out. So you can see here what I've done is just to smooth this same thing out instead of it being all stepped down. And this curve, which we'll call that a curve, is in fact the demand curve. This is the marginal willingness to pay curve is one way you could think of it, the demand curve. And what this really represents is for any particular price, how much would somebody be willing to consume, or equally for a particular quantity, for instance, marginal quantity, this third piece, how much would they pay? And in that case, we can see it's $17. The total willingness to pay, all of the area underneath, and the marginal willingness to pay each individual unit. So let's keep going with that. So this really is the basis then of demand curves, which is people's willingness to pay. And the overall, here's some things I really want you to pick up on about the demand curve. First of all, let's look at the graph, because the graph is always the same. It's very consistent. We always have the quantity demanded on the bottom axis, and we have the price on the vertical axis, the y-axis, and so demand curves are downward sloping. I mean down in this direction as opposed to up in that direction. Why are they downward sloping? Well, you have to think about the demand curve as being a line through a set of points that represent the relationship between a particular price and the amount of consumption that a person will undertake there. So for instance, if the price is very low here, like P1, and P1 is just written in a simple form there, so that's price 1 with that subscript. So at this lower price, we can follow this across to the demand curve and see that they will consume Q1, quantity Q1. And of course, quantity is increasing in this direction. You can see my little arrow there, and price is increasing in this direction. So at that low price, they'll consume Q1. At the higher price of P2, which you can see just snuck back in there, that person wants much less. They only want this quantity Q2 there. So this is the basic relationship of a demand curve, which is that when the price is low, people want to consume a lot, and when the price is high, they want to consume less. There are some qualifications to that, but I'll skip those at this moment. So there's three main reasons really why a demand curve is downward sloping. The first one is called a substitution effect. So the substitution effect says if the price is higher, then people will be motivated to find some other substitute for that same product. So for example, if the price of bananas was very high and went up, people might try to find some substitute. Perhaps that would be apples or oranges for some people, and it might be some other food for other sets of people. So you can imagine then that the more similar the products are, the more easily substitutable they are, the closer this substitution effect relationship. For example, if the price of Pepsi went up, presumably people would pretty quickly switch to Coke because they're very similar. Or I can imagine if the price of one type of BP gasoline went up or petrol went up, then people would quickly switch to Caltex gas instead because there's really very little difference between them. So the first thing then is this substitution effect and a desire to make use of a cheaper alternative. The second thing is the income effect. And what this really is saying is that we all face our budget constraints. We only have a certain amount of money that we can spend on things. And so if the price of a good goes up, then we have to look, will we continue to purchase at the same amount? Probably unlikely, could possibly be so, but that would mean then forgoing consumption on something else. So it affects our income, and we're likely to try to reduce our consumption to avoid that opportunity cost. And the third thing I've already mentioned here, which is this diminishing marginal utility, our willingness to pay for increased quantities diminishes because we get less satisfaction from them. One of the most important things to understand about demand curves is their slope. So I've said that they're downward sloping, but in fact, how steep or flat that slope is really matters because it tells a lot about the relationship between a change in the price of the good and how that affects people's behavior. So what I have here is two different demand curves. On the left one here, I have one that I'm saying is less elastic, or some people might say more inelastic. And on the right here, I have a more elastic demand curve over there. So once again, you'll notice I have the price on the vertical axis of both of these and the quantity on the bottom. Now I'm assuming that this price is, let's just call it the same. We'll say that this axis is denominated in the same units. Let's consider this might be two different people, this might be two different products that these demand curves represent, but really what I want to get at is what happens when the price increases. So let's imagine that the price increases from this particular price, without a label of course, sorry about that, from here up to here. The initial point of consumption is A on this demand curve, so that price, if I follow it over to that demand curve and come down, and that would be that beginning quantity that that person would be willing to consume at that price. Similarly, over on this demand curve, they're at A and that quantity. Now you notice when the price goes up here that the person moves, they reduce their consumption, that is, they move along the demand curve, and the quantity reduced is this much here. You can see down here it's measured on the bottom axis. So for the same amount of price increase, you can notice that on this less elastic demand curve, there wasn't much of a change in behavior here. They did reduce the quantity consumed by a bit, but not as much as over here on this very elastic demand curve. And that's really the basis of this whole concept of elasticity, that for the same proportional price change, a more elastic demand curve means that it will have a greater response in the quantity. So if the price goes up by a little bit, there will be a larger quantity change response than on a less elastic demand curve. Similarly, if the price goes down, it will go in the opposite direction. So that really speaks to the nature of the types of different goods, services that we would think about having different types of demand curves. So what this is really saying is that if a price goes up and you don't change your consumption of it very much, that is, it's less elastic or inelastic, it must mean it's very important to you, a key good that you're consuming, and probably even something that's highly important and has very few substitutes. So we might think about water or some other things that if you didn't have it, what would you really get by with? So there's a lot of key inelastic, or there's a lot of goods that have very inelastic demand curves because there's relatively few substitutes and we want to consume them even if the price goes up quite a lot. In comparison, something that's really elastic demand curve, relatively flat demand curve, there's lots of substitutes. If the price goes up, we substitute away very quickly and our quantity response is much larger. So it's probably important to note that demand curves can have different slopes, different curvature for the same people, for the same person and different goods, for the same good and different people. They can be individual, they can be aggregated up into markets. So let's just have a little bit of a look about that. So for instance, on the left one here, I have, once again, you'll notice price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal is very important because in fact the supply curve has very similar money on the vertical and the quantity on the bottom, and that's how we're able to put these together. So here you've got two different demand curves. In this case, this demand curve is more inelastic, it's steeper, more elastic. This could be the same person with two different goods, perhaps at different times in their life and that so on. So let's get into that a little bit more. But before we do, let me talk about aggregating demand curves. And what I want to talk about here is how you would add up individual demand from individual consumers into an aggregate demand which would represent an entire market or a country, a city, imagine what you will. So let's start off here. You can see that I have three separate demand curves. This one here, this one looks to be from Maurice, and then I have a demand curve from Beatrice, and another one from Bjorn. It's kind of sounding like ABBA or something. Anyway, let's keep going with that. So I have, it's the same good. Now in this case, I'm aggregating it up. It's really important to note this is the same good that we're purchasing here. So let's imagine it's loaves of bread. Okay, so how much would each person be willing to pay for a loaf of bread? Gosh, that price looks pretty expensive. Maybe I should make it movies instead, which might be somewhat more realistic for the prices that I have. Let's go with movies. So I look over here at Maurice and I say, Maurice, at a price of $14, how many movies would Maurice consume? And I simply follow that price over to Maurice's demand curve. And at that point there, I come down to the horizontal axis, the quantity axis, and I can see Maurice consume 3. At that same price, then I can look and say, all right, Beatrice, at that price, actually, Beatrice will not consume anything, any of those movies. That's just priced beyond what she's willing to pay. And then I come over here to Bjorn, and Bjorn's in for 2. So I add 3 here for Maurice and the 2 that Bjorn would consume, and then I move from here. Essentially, I create a new demand curve that adds those together. So at a price of 14, I'm adding the 3 plus the 2, and I get this new value of 5. All right, similarly down here, I'm constructing this aggregate demand curve by adding horizontally across these other demand curves. So at a price of 6, Maurice is in for 10. Beatrice now, that's a price she's willing to pay, so she'll take 5, and Bjorn wants 8, so that adds up to 23. And so I've got a point over here, and you can imagine that if I did that for each of the different prices all the way down these demand curves, I would get this aggregate demand curve. So that is the basis of how we aggregate from individual demand curves, and you can see it's important to note that even for the same product, people's demand curves are very different depending on their tastes and incomes, but we can nonetheless add all of that up together to create a market-wide demand curve. That wasn't what I wanted to do. Okay, now what I'd like to talk about is shifts in demand curves. So so far what we've talked about is something that is a change in the price, and that then causes a change in the quantity demanded. Let me just switch this over here. So, as I've previously said, the demand curve is a relationship, a connection of points through prices and quantities. So any change in price then will result in a movement along the demand curve. The price goes up, the quantity consumed goes down, and it's a new point on the demand curve, right? Okay, well, let's talk about shifts in the demand curve instead. So what a shift would be is, for instance, in this case, it's an outward shift, an overall increase in demand. And you can see that, for instance, for a value like, let's look at 15 here. So for a price of 15 on the original demand curve, and I'm calling that D1, the quantity consumed was 6, and on the new demand curve, the quantity is 14. So at the same price, there's a larger quantity demanded. That's a shift in the demand curve. Of course, it could go in the opposite direction too. So on the one hand, we can look at it at the same price, there's more quantity demanded, but equally we could say at a single quantity, for example, here maybe let's look at 6. 6 on the initial demand curve, 15, at an initial quantity of 6 here on the initial demand curve, people are willing to pay a price of 15 for that. Now they're willing to pay a price of 25. So for the same quantity, they'll pay more. So two ways of looking at a shift in the demand curve. All right. So what actually causes a shift in the demand curve? There's a number of different key determinants of that. So let's look at those. Shifts in the demand curve can be caused by changes in income. So for example, if you get an increase in your wage at work, or you win the lottery, or Granny leaves you some money, that could be an increase in your income. And now, because you have less of a budget constraint, you can purchase more of everything. So for example, whereas previously you might only have wanted 6 at $15, now you would love to have 14. So change in income can be one reason for the demand curve to shift, and that of course could happen either for individuals or for a market as a whole. The second thing would be changes in consumer expectations, and what I mean by that is if you thought that the price of something was going to go up next week, then you would be more likely to purchase it this week. So for example, a cyclone is heading towards the coast of Queensland. You love bananas. You're pretty sure that the banana crop is going to be affected, and with a reduction in supply, the price will go up. So you go and purchase bananas early. Or indeed, if there's a cyclone coming, perhaps it'd be more pressing to go get water. So you're imagining, roads may be cut off. The local retailer is for sure going to put up the price of water, so I better go get some right now. So changes in expectation can cause shifts in the demand curve. And of course, these can work in the reverse direction too. A change in expectation could cause the price to come down. You hear some rumor there's going to be a sale at some store next week. Everybody knows about it. Let's hold off on purchasing this week until the sale comes on. So change in expectations. Change in the number of consumers. So imagine that thousands of people move to a new city, and that increases. So for example, at a price of 15, now there's just more people that want that same product, so the quantity demanded goes up. Changes in taste. So what that would be is, even for the same, well, you might change your tastes and preferences based on, well, it could be many things. Let's imagine it's based on learning something. So for example, you used to love chocolate bars, and then you found out that they contained palm oil, and you were distressed to find out that with all of the clear cutting going on in Indonesia to plant palm oil plantations, that was having a terrible effect on the environment and decimating the orangutan population. It was heartbreaking, and of course it is. It's a terrible, terrible situation. So you decided that you were no longer going to buy that cheap brand of chocolate, and instead you switched over to some other chocolate, maybe a fair trade chocolate or something else. So that would be, in this case, a shift inward in the demand curve, which is to say, at any price, now you would be consuming less of it. So we can imagine that changes in taste would have an impact on lots of different products, and of course we go in both directions of increases and decreases in demand. Now the final thing here would be changes in the price of complements and substitutes. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to get to that in just the next slide. So first of all, I just wanted to restate that if it's a shift outward, the demand, it's basically that the quantity demanded increases, right, for every single price. And alternatively, you could think of that for any particular quantity, the amount that people would be willing to pay, the price is higher. Now, one final thing before I go on. There are certain goods, and this really relates to income here, where if you got more money, your consumption of it would go down. So I'll give you a second to think about some of those. For all of you students now and students of old, you probably remember the macaroni consuming days of living in university housing and having no money, and basically looking for ramen noodles or something cheap as a source of food to get you through. Now, when you make more money, obviously, you tend to be interested in purchasing better food and better quality things. So those are called inferior goods, and when your income goes up, you tend to purchase less inferior goods. Otherwise, these normal goods, when your income goes up, you would consume more of them. All right, now let me get into demand curve shifts as a result of changes in the price of a complement or a substitute. So let's consider demand curve for paper. And I've got two types of paper here. One is eco paper, and what I'm thinking about here is 100% recycled paper with a Forest Stewardship Council certification. And if you are not sure what that means, that's an independent verification that the forestry practices from where that wood and paper was derived were sustainably undertaken, probably minimal impact on the ecosystem, perhaps special attention to local land use values and indigenous values, and so on. Many different criteria go into an independent certification there. So it's essentially a sustainability stamp of approval, if you will. So eco paper costs more to make it. People like it, but it does cost more. And then over here on the other side, I have regular paper. So let's look at these two different demand curves. So I've got price again on my horizontal axis. So I can see at a price of $20, and I'm imagining this being a box of 5 little packages, reams, I think they're called, a box of those, going for, and when the price was $20, the quantity consumed was 9,000 boxes. And over here you'll notice that of the regular paper, which might be slightly more destructive and have no recycled content in it, for all the people who can just free their minds of that guilty use of such an unsustainable resource. At $20, there was 20,000 consumed. So probably just a couple of things to note here. You can have demand curves here, and you can see that they really are for different products. And on this one, the quantity in the bottom here is only 9,000, over here is 20,000. So I've got a bit of a scale issue here, but two different demand curves. This one's a little bit flatter or more elastic. This one is slightly less elastic. And you might imagine that people that are committed to sustainable purchasing would be more willing to spend a bit more for that, even if the price went up, perhaps wouldn't change their consumption quite as much. So let's look at what happens if there's an increase in the price of eco paper. So here I have it going from $20 up to $28. And you can see, of course, that means that consumption goes down, a movement along the demand curve for this good. So the price of eco paper went up, moving along the demand curve, quantity goes down. What happens to the demand for regular paper? Well, we can imagine that there would be quite a few people, businesses and so on, that would say, you know, eco paper is just getting too expensive, becoming too costly, so we're going to switch over to regular paper, which the price didn't change, and so that, you can see, is actually going to cause, at that same price of 20, more people being willing to and interested to purchase it, so the consumption has gone up. So that is a outward shift in this case of the demand curve. So price change for this good causes a movement along the demand curve for that good, but in this case, a substitute good causes a shift in the demand curve. Now, if you're looking closely, you might see that 4,000 less boxes were purchased here, but only 3,000 more were purchased over here. And you can imagine, once again, income effects and other things. Some people might have just decided that paper was getting too expensive altogether and they were going to switch to digital. So they did not purchase that 1,000 boxes at all. So that's an example of price in one good affecting a shift of demand in another good. And that happens all the time, and something definitely to be aware of and take up in your work in economics. So let's look at a different thing. So here what I'd like to focus on is a price change and its effect on a complementary good. So now what I have here, I still have my demand for eco paper here, and the price went up. But now over here I have demand for printers. So printers, of course, are a complementary good. You have paper, you have printers, you put them together, you have printed paper. So let's look at what happens when there's a price increase, that same price increase, $28, quantity demand goes down, and demand for printers goes down. So that kind of makes sense. Price of paper is more expensive. The total cost to operate a printer more expensive. People's interest in printing goes down, and the printing curve shifts here to the left. Once again, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so let's look at this now and think about what would happen if the demand, what would happen if the price of oil went up? So now you have to think about oil being something that's actually used in a lot of different other items. So you can imagine it's going to be that same circumstance of a price for one good going up, and right away we can say, well, if the price of oil goes up, less will be consumed. But what will happen to other goods, complementary and substitute goods? So let's have a little look. You can imagine, first of all, consumer behavior. If the price of oil goes up, the price of petrol goes up, driving to work becomes more expensive, people begin to look for substitutes. And those type of substitutes might be, they might bike to work, or they may take public transit to work, or they may purchase an electric car because they don't want to continue to pay the high price for petrol. So that's examples of price of a good in one market affecting these are substitute goods in another market. So let's have another look. Well, but as I said before, oil is used in many different products. So think about the impact, not so much on consumers now, but on other manufacturers and producers, and in this case, maybe transporters. So how easy would it be for people who are shipping one way or the other to substitute away from some type of an oil product, if it's a diesel or petrol, whatever it might be. So you can imagine kind of pretty difficult probably on ships like this. I mean, they really are only meant to run on one fuel. Some of them have sails. Similarly on trucks and so on, there might be a shift, and planes especially, you can think, really require very high-end aviation fuel. It's expensive to begin with, and there's really not too many substitutes, a few biofuels coming onto the market now, but not very easy for these particular producers to shift away from oil. So you can imagine their demand curves and probably are relatively steep or inelastic compared to some other producers. Now, in addition to, you can imagine that there would be a increase then because these producers now are paying more for fuel and they require fuel to do all the different things they do. Their costs are going to go up. So somehow either they will be paying more costs overall and presumably making less profit, or they'll have to pass on the cost of that fuel increase to their consumers, and that may be us and maybe other businesses and so on. You can imagine that if price of petrol goes way up, then we may end up with a levy in plane fares to cover the extra cost. And indeed, we've seen that in the past. Now, there's a lot of, so I mean, here's some more industries you can imagine. So, fishing would use fuel. If you think about farming, farming not only uses fuel for the operation of machinery, but actually there's a lot of chemicals, especially pesticides and fertilizers that are derived from petrochemicals. So farming would be heavily impacted by an increase in the price of oil. Similarly, operating in wood or other manufacturing of chemicals that were derived from petroleum products would similarly be affected. Interestingly, though, what else is going to happen when the price of fuel, price of oil goes up? A few things. First of all, because the price is higher, there's now an interest in exploring other areas. I mean, imagine you're getting more for the product. Suppliers are going to like that. So they begin to look for other sources of oil that they can exploit. Maybe it's more expensive, oil offshore and so on, but the overall interest in supplying the higher price increases. Substitute-wise, though, people begin to look for other options to steer away from the high cost of oil, and renewable energy would be some of those, for example, hydro energy or wind energy. And at the same time, they would be looking for perhaps switching over to other other substitute goods. So instead of using oil, for instance, for many manufacturing processes, maybe they would be interested in using coal instead, and energy production would be a great example of this. Many different thermal power generation facilities can switch back and forth, or made to switch back and forth, and typically they switch between oil and gas, and sometimes potentially between coal and oil, or coal and oil and gas. Depending on the price of those fuels, they switch back and forth between them. And indeed, that's quite interesting because it has consequences for climate change, with coal being the most polluting and oil being the next, followed by gas. In fact, you may be interested to know that the price of emissions permits fluctuates quite a lot on differences in the price of fuels, because markets expect if the price of coal drops, then people will shift to it and emissions will go up as a result, and therefore the need for permits will go up and permit prices do go up. So these are the types of cause and effect relationships that we explore in environmental and resource economics, and I look forward to telling you more about them. So just in closing then, I'd like you to undertake this demand curve self-review test. And this is the type of stuff that would often show up on an environmental resource economics exam. But otherwise, if you're just a lover of environmental resource economics for its own value, then these are things that you really want to understand closely. So be able to draw a demand curve and know what is on each axis. Get that down, quantity on the horizontal axis, price, cost, and so on will be, cost is in the supply curve, but it's the dollar figure on the vertical axis. Does it slope up or does it slope down? And to be able to explain why. What does it mean if the demand curve is steeper, that is less elastic or more inelastic? And what does it mean if it's flatter or more elastic? Describe that, explain what that means. And that really is this relationship between what happens when the price changes in terms of consumer behavior for the quantity demanded change. What does it mean if the demand curve is convex compared to linear, right? That is, what does it mean if the demand curve is a curve, like I've shown in my diagrams, compared to a straight line? I'm going to leave that one with you. Think about that one. And it has to do with for any point on the curve, when the price changes, how much of a quantity change do you get? And you'll know you're on the right track if you happen to notice that on a curve, there are sections of that demand curve that are more elastic on the same curve, and there are sections of the demand curve that are less elastic, right? Whereas a linear curve, it's constantly elastic. at the different spots. Okay, next, what causes the demand curve to shift in or down or up or out? It's kind of, depending on how steep the curve is, it's hard to say if it's moving up or out. But what causes shifts in the demand curve? You should be able to say the different reasons behind that. And finally, how does the price of a price change for one good affect the demand for that good, and how does it affect the demand for complementary or substitute goods? Okay, hope you found that useful. And in the next video, I will be talking about supply and how that's derived from the marginal cost curve. So hope to see you there. Thanks.